The plane shuddered violently, its steel frame groaning under the weight of the storm outside. Vanessa Lewis, a black woman in her late 30s, an ordinary passenger, or so everyone thought, now sat in the captain's chair. Her hands gripped the yoke, knuckles pale, but her gaze was unwavering, locked on the trembling horizon. Behind her, Captain Grant and his unconscious co-pilot had all but ceded command. His uniform was sweat-stained, face pale, eyes wide, not just with fear but disbelief. That a passenger, a black woman from coach, had taken control. The cockpit was a storm within a storm. Flickering lights, flashing red warnings, an urgent chorus of alarms. Behind the sealed door, passengers clung to their armrests and to each other. Children whimpered, and adults prayed in choked whispers. The smell of burned wiring and fear hung in the air. Vanessa's voice broke through the chaos, low but clear, steady in its defiance. "Let's get this bird steady." No one knew her name yet. No one knew she had once flown thousands of hours in military simulators, that she had trained for emergencies precisely like this, before leaving the Air Force, before walking away from the sky. The controls vibrated in her hands. She could feel it in her bones. This was no ordinary emergency. One engine was gone, the other was overheating. Hydraulics were failing, autopilot was dead. The plane, a crippled giant, was falling toward the mountains below. Captain Grant, slumped and speechless beside her, whispered hoarsely, "You're the passenger?" Vanessa didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She spoke softly, as much to herself as to the man who'd surrendered his aircraft. "Not anymore." Outside the windshield, far below, the ragged shadow of an abandoned Cold War airstrip flickered into view. Mackenzie Ridge, rough and cracked, barely long enough for this 170-ton aircraft. But it was their only chance. The radio crackled uselessly. They were out of range, out of options. Time was gone. The cockpit alarms kept screaming, "Stall! Low altitude! Hydraulic failure!" Vanessa flicked off the audio warning system with a single decisive click. She didn't need noise, she needed instinct. Inside the cabin, a terrible quiet had descended. The passengers could feel it. Something critical was happening up front. What they didn't know, couldn't yet know, was that their lives now hung in the hands of a woman who had boarded their flight with nothing but a backpack and a return ticket to Seattle. This was never supposed to happen. But it was happening. The plane jolted again, pitching forward. Vanessa adjusted trim manually, her fingers moving with a memory she thought she'd lost. Her whole body was taut, but her mind was razor-sharp. Calculating glide ratio, descent rate, ground speed. The last sliver of day was fading fast, the storm clouds tightening around them. Ahead, the airstrip waited short, overgrown, and lined by forest on either side. A single mistake, and they would end up a headline. Crash in the Cascades, no survivors. But not if she had anything to do with it. Her voice was calm as she muttered aloud, "Landing gear down." The indicator was dead. She toggled the switch manually, praying gravity would help them now. Somewhere beneath them she felt, or maybe imagined, a dull thunk. Behind her, Captain Grant watched, helpless but transfixed. In 25 years of flying, he'd never relinquished control. But now, here he was, watching a passenger do what no one else could. A woman who wasn't supposed to be in this seat. A black woman who had once been told she wasn't fit for command, now commanding everything. As the plane began its final descent, Vanessa inhaled deeply, fingers tightening around the yoke. This wasn't just about skill, this was about destiny. "I didn't come here to fly today," she thought, eyes locked on the narrowing runway below. But maybe I was meant to. Denver International Airport hummed with its usual early morning rhythm. Travelers wheeled suitcases past busy cafes and duty-free shops, faces buried in phones, ears tuned to last-minute boarding calls. Among them walked Vanessa Lewis, calm, alone, backpack slung over one shoulder. To any observer, she looked like just another passenger headed home. Inconspicuous, unremarkable. But Vanessa carried a history no one at Gate 26 could have guessed. Her ticket read Flight 982 to Seattle, window seat 17A. As she settled into the seat, fastening her belt and slipping her phone into airplane mode, she let out a small sigh, the kind of sigh that comes from someone who once lived in the sky but had long since left it behind. Outside her window, the tarmac shimmered in the morning light. The engines powered up with a familiar growl, the kind that once thrilled her, but not anymore. Vanessa Lewis had once worn a different uniform. She was a former Air Force cadet, one of the most promising in her class at Maxwell Air Force Base. Her instructors said she had the best hands on the stick they'd ever seen. Reflexes sharp, calculations second nature. She logged hundreds of hours in simulators and cockpits, mastering stall recoveries, emergency maneuvers, and precision landings. And yet, she never earned her wings. During her final evaluations, rumors swirled behind closed doors that she was too emotional under pressure, that she lacked the cool detachment needed for combat situations. Words unspoken but deeply felt, that she, a young black woman, didn't fit the mold of the confident, calm, white male pilot the Air Force had long been built to expect. Her instructors didn't tell her to quit. They didn't have to. The institutional cold shoulder, the sideways glances, the relentless second-guessing wore her down. She walked away voluntarily. At least on paper. In truth, it broke her. Vanessa returned to civilian life, pivoting into software development, finding refuge in code and quiet offices, where no one questioned her ability to think fast or solve complex problems. But even as she built a respectable new life, part of her felt dislodged, like she'd left an essential piece of herself behind at that airfield. 6 years had passed since she last sat at the controls of an aircraft. Flying had once been freedom, but it became a reminder of rejection. So she chose to be a passenger, to stay away from decisions measured in split seconds and lives. And yet, even as she sipped overpriced airport coffee that morning, waiting at Gate 26, she could not help but glance at the aircraft outside with a kind of yearning. She told herself it was nostalgia. She told herself it didn't matter. She was wrong. On board Flight 982, the first hour passed uneventfully. Vanessa closed her eyes as they climbed to cruising altitude, appreciating the relative peace of not being responsible. She watched sunlight catch the edge of a cloud, turning it into a brilliant halo. Then came the turbulence. At first mild, just enough to rattle ice in plastic cups, then sharper, harder, the kind that snapped seatbelts tight and quieted conversations. Vanessa's eyes opened immediately. Instinct, old and half-forgotten, stirred within her. She listened closely, not just to the captain's shaky announcement, but to the sounds under her feet, the vibrations in the fuselage, the subtle whine of the engine's shifting pitch. Something wasn't right. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. When the second jolt came, far stronger, accompanied by a sickening drop that drew screams from the cabin, Vanessa's hands clenched the armrests, but her mind was already running calculations. The plane was descending in a controlled way, but not confidently. It felt uncertain. She looked around. Flight attendants exchanged panicked glances. One gripped the intercom panel as if it alone could hold her steady. Then came the bang, loud, violent. The entire aircraft lurched to one side. Oxygen masks fell, passengers cried, gasped, prayed. Vanessa did not pray. she did not panic. Her training, buried deep, layered over by years of self-doubt, surfaced with cold clarity. She could feel it in her fingertips, the way she used to read an aircraft like a living thing. It wasn't just turbulence. The plane was in trouble. And no one was coming. No one, unless she stood up. For a moment, Vanessa froze. Memories of Maxwell Base returned. The dismissals, the sidelong looks, the subtle yet heavy verdict. You're not built for this. But then she saw something else. The terror in the faces around her, the children clinging to their parents, the flight attendant whispering into the phone, trembling. This was the test they said she couldn't pass. Without another thought, she rose from her seat. I'm a trained pilot, she told the nearest attendant. Air Force certified. If they need help, I can give it. The attendant hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing toward the cockpit. Vanessa sat back down, heart pounding, sweat beading on her temple. She hadn't touched a cockpit in years. Could she really step in again, here, now, when everything was at stake? A minute later, the attendant returned, face pale. The captain wants to see you. Vanessa stood again, straighter this time. Everything in her life, all the failures, all the decisions, all the doubts, had led to this aisle, this moment, this walk toward the cockpit. She hadn't come here to fly. But maybe she was meant to. Excellent, let's continue the story seamlessly. The cockpit doors slid open with a mechanical hiss that seemed impossibly loud over the sounds of panic beyond it. Vanessa stepped inside and was immediately hit by the stench of burned wiring, sweat, and raw adrenaline. The lights on the overhead panel blinked in chaotic reds and ambers, a digital symphony of failure. The air felt heavy, hot, claustrophobic. Captain Grant looked up at her, his uniform disheveled, hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes, sharp and commanding only hours earlier, were glassy and bloodshot now, the look of a man far beyond fatigue. You're the passenger? He asked, voice hoarse and frayed. Vanessa Lewis, former Air Force cadet, certified CFI. Her words were clipped, efficient, professional. You called for me. Grant nodded quickly, gesturing toward the right-hand seat, where the co-pilot lay slumped sideways, unconscious. His oxygen mask dangled uselessly, his skin pale. Without hesitation, Vanessa checked his pulse. Weak, shallow breathing, likely hypoxia-induced faint. No time to revive him. She slid into his seat. Talk to me, Captain, she said, already scanning the instrument panel. Left engine's gone, Grant rattled off. Right engine's overheating, hydraulics unreliable, autopilot dead, nav glitching. We lost ATC contact 15 minutes ago. We're about 28 minutes out from Seattle, but we won't make it. The words hit like a punch, but Vanessa's training, dormant but intact, processed them instantly. She slipped on the headset. Okay, first things first, let's level this bird. The yoke felt stiff in her grip, sluggish and trembling. The horizon line on the primary display was flickering, the plane trapped in a shallow left bank and a steady descent, the beginning of an uncontrolled spiral if unchecked. Vanessa adjusted the trim manually, using backup analog readings to recalibrate pitch. Gradually, the plane's angle eased, the shaking softened. For the first time in what felt like hours, the aircraft held a steady attitude. Grant let out a breath, but his face was still etched with tension. What's our altitude? She asked. 8,200 feet, dropping at 700 feet per minute. Too fast, too low. Vanessa quickly scanned the remaining navigational data. The route to Seattle was impossible. They'd never stay in the air that long with the current fuel burn and engine strain. Maps, she ordered. Grant handed her a backup tablet with offline terrain data. She scrolled quickly, eyes scanning topography. Miles of forest, deep ravines, and jagged cliffs filled the screen. Well then, there. Mackenzie Ridge, she said aloud, tapping the screen. Old Cold War airstrip, not on modern flight plans, but it's close. Glide range, close. Grant frowned. It's abandoned. No maintenance, no lights. It's better than the side of a mountain. His eyes met hers, a flicker of doubt, but also of hope. He nodded. You sure about this? Vanessa's lips pressed into a hard line. No, she said flatly. But it's our best shot. She keyed the emergency beacon, sending a blunt SOS ping through a degraded secondary system, barely enough to alert anyone nearby, but maybe it would buy them rescue support at the airstrip. Outside the cockpit, the chaos in the cabin had quieted into a strange, heavy hush. The passengers had heard vague announcements, additional support in the cockpit, but they didn't know, they couldn't know, that their fate now rested in the hands of a woman who'd boarded this flight with no intention of flying anything at all. Vanessa focused. No room for fear, not now. We need to reduce descent rate, she muttered. Grant shook his head. Hydraulics won't deploy flabs. Landing gear is a gamble. Rudders barely responding. Vanessa tapped the panel gently, as if coaxing the aircraft itself. Then we do it manually. Every inch of control we still have, we use. She throttled the remaining engine carefully, adjusting angle of attack for a shallow descent. The stick vibrated dangerously close to stall speed. Every adjustment felt like a negotiation with gravity itself. She could feel the weight of every soul behind her. Parents, children, elderly travelers, people who trusted this metal bird to carry them home safely, and who now, unknowingly, trusted her. Ahead, through gaps in the thickening clouds, the dark slash of Mackenzie Ridge emerged. Primitive, cracked, narrow, ringed by dense forest and barely long enough to stop them even under ideal conditions. Vanessa locked eyes with Grant. You want to land her? He asked quietly. Vanessa shook her head, steady and certain. You're in no shape for this. I've got it. He hesitated for only a second before slowly pulling his hands off the controls, the final surrender, and with that the captain of a commercial jet carrying 181 souls handed his plane to a black woman he'd never met, a passenger from coach, with nothing but instinct and grit to guide her. Vanessa's fingers tightened on the yoke. All right, girl, she whispered to herself, let's see if you still know how to dance. The altimeter ticked down, numbers falling like a countdown. Vanessa couldn't stop. Her palms were slick but steady, wrapped around the yoke as if it were an extension of her own spine. The cockpit smelled of burning insulation and fear, but Vanessa tuned it all out. Outside the windshield, Mackenzie Ridge appeared, dim and ragged, an ancient Cold War airstrip barely distinguishable from the dense forest surrounding it. That's it, she whispered to herself. The right seat. Captain Grant watched her, sweat dripping from his brow, hands trembling slightly but held close to his lap, deliberately out of the way. His trust was complete now. He had surrendered his airplane, his crew, his passengers, and his fate to a woman who hadn't sat in a cockpit in years. Vanessa glanced at the altimeter, 3,500 feet and descending too fast. We need to bleed speed or we'll overshoot, she said. Flaps won't deploy, hydraulics are still down, Grant reminded her grimly. Vanessa tapped her finger on the control panel, thinking fast. The plane was overweight, underpowered, with unreliable systems. She couldn't fight physics, but she could negotiate with it. Landing gear, she muttered. The automatic indicator was dark. She reached down and yanked the manual gear lever, praying gravity alone would drop the wheels into place. A dull metallic thunk echoed through the cabin. One gear down, maybe. Captain, I need a visual confirmation on gear, she ordered. Grant flicked on a backup inspection camera. The grainy black and white image flickered to life on a small side monitor. 2 gear looks locked, can't confirm the others. It would have to be enough. We're landing either way. Vanessa said flatly. At 2,000 feet, they dropped below the clouds. The airstrip finally came into full view, cracked concrete, weeds pushing through the seams, flanked by rescue vehicles hastily assembled. Fire trucks, police cruisers, ambulances. Their headlights formed makeshift runway lights. The rest of the airfield was darkness and trees. There would be no go-around. "You got this, Vanessa," she whispered under her breath. The stick trembled in her hands, the engine whined, sputtering under strain, coughing exhaust and threatening to quit at any moment. "Altitude 1,500 feet, Grant read out. The stall warning blared. "Too slow." Vanessa silenced it with a flick, refusing to let that noise cloud her thoughts. She was balancing on a knife's edge. Too fast and they'd overshoot, too slow and they'd fall short or stall out. Her senses narrowed, her breath slowed, hands precise, mind eerily calm. The world outside the cockpit was distant, the terrified passengers, the stormy sky, the endless mountains, waiting for a mistake. 500 feet, Grant called. A rush of treetops passed under them. The narrow strip of concrete loomed closer, framed by flashlight signals and flashing strobes. Vanessa held the descent shallow, nose slightly up, angling for a perfect flare. But she knew perfection wasn't possible here. Survival was enough. 200 feet. She felt the crosswind buffet the plane's tail and corrected gently, instinct guiding her rather than gauges. The left engine was gone, the right engine wheezing toward failure. If it died now, they'd glide the last few seconds on sheer luck and skill alone. 100 feet. "Brace," she whispered, to herself, to the plane, to fate itself. Then ground rushed up, fast and unforgiving. With a hard slam, the front wheels struck first, jarring every bone in her body. The rear wheels followed with a metallic scream as rubber burned and tires shredded on impact. Sparks flew from beneath the cabin. The entire aircraft bounced once, twice, then, finally, settled with a sickening grind. Vanessa threw all her weight into the manual braking system, forcing every ounce of resistance the old hydraulics could muster. Smoke poured from the undercarriage. Oxygen masks swung wildly above passengers' heads. People screamed, prayed, clutched the seats in front of them. The plane skidded, shuddered, fought for every inch, then lurched to a dead stop, just 40 feet from the tree line. For a moment, there was only silence. No alarms, no voices, just the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of Vanessa's own heartbeat in her ears. Then, from the cabin, a tiny voice broke the silence, a child's whisper, "Did we just land?" A ragged cheer erupted. Passengers laughed, sobbed, clapped. Flight attendants fell to their knees, embracing one another in disbelief. Inside the cockpit, Captain Grant sat frozen, staring at the controls, then at Vanessa. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just land the plane," he said, voice hoarse with awe. "You saved a world today." But Vanessa didn't reply. "Ah, yes." Her hands still gripped the yoke, knuckles white, shoulders tense. The storm outside was fading, but inside her, a new storm was just beginning. The stillness inside the cockpit was deafening. For a moment, Vanessa Lewis didn't move. The world outside the cracked windshield was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, searchlights cutting through mist, and the urgent shuffle of emergency crews racing toward the aircraft. Behind her, the cabin had erupted into a cacophony of sobs, laughter, and the unmistakable sound of survival. But she sat frozen, still gripping the yoke. Her shoulders ached. Her hands trembled now, no longer steady as they had been in those final moments of descent. It was over. They were alive. Captain Grant finally spoke, his voice low and full of wonder. "That was the most impossible landing I've ever seen, and you did it." His hand, tentative but firm, rested on her shoulder, an acknowledgement more profound than applause. Vanessa slowly released her grip on the yoke, realizing how tightly she'd been holding it. Her fingers throbbed as she flexed them for the first time since touchdown. "We need to get the passengers out," she whispered. Grant nodded immediately. "Emergency exits. Let's move." In the cabin, the flight attendants were already springing into action. Slides deployed from the cabin doors, inflating with a mechanical whoosh. One by one, passengers began sliding to safety, some stumbling as they reached solid ground, others falling to their knees and kissing the cracked concrete of Mackenzie Ridge. Vanessa remained in the cockpit, watching the evacuation unfold. When she finally unbuckled and stood, the full weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, not as adrenaline, but as gravity itself. She stepped into the cabin and froze. Every pair of eyes turned to her. A woman near the front clutched two small children close, her face streaked with tears. She mouthed silently, "Thank you." An elderly man struggled to rise from his seat, clutching the armrest for balance before giving her a trembling salute. A teenage boy simply stared, wide-eyed, as if he were looking at a superhero. Vanessa had no words. She offered them only a quiet nod, no speeches, no grand gestures before moving down the aisle, gently guiding the last few passengers to the exit. As she stepped out onto the cracked airstrip, a spontaneous cheer erupted. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't for cameras. It was raw, human, and full of awe. Survivors clapped, some crying openly, others pointing toward the plane that should never have landed, and to the woman who had done the impossible. The paramedic rushed toward her. "Are you injured?" he asked, urgent and concerned. Vanessa shook her head. "I'm fine, but the co-pilot is still inside. He needs help first." The paramedics hurried past her into the cockpit. Vanessa stood alone now, surrounded by the chaotic ballet of emergency response, firefighters dousing the overheated engine with foam, police setting up barricades, reporters arriving with cameras already rolling. In the midst of it all, she turned and looked back at the plane. It sat awkwardly on the ruined airstrip, landing gear buckled but intact, streaks of burned rubber tracing its desperate skid. A miracle. No, not a miracle. A product of instinct, training, and the part of herself she thought she'd buried years ago. Captain Grant appeared beside her, his uniform damp, eyes shadowed but clear now. "They're going to want your name," he said softly. "Your face, your whole life story." Vanessa didn't answer. "They're calling it the landing of the century," he added, almost incredulous. "But between us, I've flown for 30 years. I would never have attempted that. I would have ditched in the trees." He finally turned to meet his gaze. "You did everything you could," she said simply. "You brought us low enough to try." Grant nodded once, grateful. "But you," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you were the reason we walked away." Near the edge of the airstrip, reporters were gathering, waving microphones, shouting questions. "Ma'am, were you really just a passenger? How did you do it? Are you a hero?" Vanessa turned away from them, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not doing interviews," she said, "not today." She moved toward one of the fire trucks and sat on its rear bumper, accepting a bottle of water from a paramedic whose face was pale with disbelief. Her hands shook as she twisted the cap open. What she'd done no one had expected. Not her colleagues in tech, not the passengers, not even herself. But in the quiet between adrenaline and exhaustion, a simple truth settled into place. She hadn't landed that plane in spite of being a woman, or in spite of being a former pilot who walked away. She had landed it because, at her core, she had never stopped being who she was, even when the world told her otherwise. Somewhere behind her, a child's voice rang out, "That lady saved us!" Carried over the crowd, full of innocence and wonder, and suddenly Vanessa understood what this moment meant. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Morning crept softly over Mackenzie Ridge. pale sunlight filtering through the lingering mist that draped the trees, casting a silver sheen over the cracked concrete of the old airstrip. In a small bunk room of the volunteer firehouse nearby, Vanessa Lewis sat hunched on the edge of a narrow cot, elbows resting on her knees, fingers loosely interlaced, her gaze distant and unfocused. Her boots, scuffed and dusted from the landing, sat heavy on the floor like anchors, and beside her, on a makeshift table, her phone vibrated incessantly, alive with a flood of calls and messages that she refused to answer. Her name was on every screen across America by now. Reporters clamored for interviews, news anchors repeated her story with incredulous awe, military recruiters sought to entice her back into uniform, and film agents floated offers to dramatize her life. Overnight, she had become the face of heroism. A face captured in a blurry photograph snapped moments after touchdown. Sweat-soaked, dazed, her expression a raw mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. She was, as headlines everywhere declared, the black woman passenger who had defied expectation and saved 181 souls. But Vanessa wasn't interested in becoming a headline. She sat still, feeling as if her body had not yet caught up to what had happened, her mind processing not the praise but the quiet truth of it. She had simply done what needed to be done when no one else could. Just before dawn, Captain Grant appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame as if reluctant to break the silence she had built around herself. In a voice softened by exhaustion and respect, he told her they were being asked to attend a press conference in Eugene. The FAA, airline executives, even the governor, were waiting to honor her. Vanessa kept her gaze lowered for a long beat before replying, almost to herself, that she hadn't done it for honor. Grant's answer was quiet but direct. That was exactly why she deserved them. Reluctantly, she rose and followed him outside, stepping into the chilled air as a waiting SUV pulled up, escorted by police vehicles. As they drove down the winding mountain road, reporters swarmed along the shoulder, cameras flashing, microphones raised in futile pursuit. Vanessa turned her face away, leaning into the cool window, her thoughts elsewhere. Not on the accolades to come, but on her parents, who were surely watching all of this unfold on their television, unaware until now that their daughter had ever stepped back into a cockpit. The press conference itself was chaotic, a wall of cameras and questions, but Vanessa stood beside Grant with composed silence as he addressed the crowd first, his words full of genuine respect for her skill and composure under pressure. When her turn came, she approached the podium slowly, pausing to take in the sea of faces and flashing bulbs. For a moment she simply stood there, letting the weight of it all settle. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady but low, each word deliberate. She said she had boarded that plane as a passenger, but that she was also a trained pilot, one who had walked away from aviation years ago because she had been told she wasn't suited for emergencies, that she lacked the cold detachment they thought necessary for command. She let that truth hang in the air before adding that this had, indeed, been an emergency. She insisted that she hadn't saved the plane alone, that Captain Grant had brought them low enough to have a chance, that the crew had remained calm, that the firefighters below had lit the airstrip with every light they could find. She acknowledged them all, and then, with simple honesty, admitted, yes, she flew the plane and landed it. Not for recognition or fame, but because someone had to act. The applause that followed was immediate and genuine, rising into a standing ovation that felt to her both humbling and distant. In the days that followed, the offers only multiplied. Keynote speeches, book deals, TV appearances, and even an invitation from the military to return in full uniform. Vanessa declined every one of them without hesitation. She had no desire for attention or celebrity. What moved her instead was a single letter that arrived quietly among the piles of mail and messages. A handwritten note from a 12-year-old girl in Kansas who had watched the news and written simply that her brother said girls couldn't fly planes, but that she had seen Vanessa do it, and now she wanted to be like her. That letter sat on Vanessa's kitchen counter long after everything else had been discarded or ignored. It was then that she picked up the phone, but not to call an agent or a journalist. She called the airline itself. Speaking directly to its CEO, she told him she didn't want contracts, endorsements, or a media campaign. What she wanted instead was simple and clear: a scholarship fund. Not for her, but for girls like that 12-year-old in Kansas, for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in aviation, for those who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. The airline agreed without hesitation, and so, quietly, without cameras or speeches, the Vanessa Lewis Flight Academy Fund was born. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa visited local flight schools where she met young women and minority students who had never seen a pilot who looked like them. She spoke little but powerfully, sharing a single message: that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to take control anyway. And just like that, without ceremony or fanfare, Vanessa began the work that would define her legacy, not as a headline, but as a mentor, a teacher, and a quiet force for change. Weeks passed quietly, but the story of Flight 982 continued to ripple outward in ways Vanessa could not have anticipated. Her name had settled into the fabric of national conversation, yet she remained elusive, declining interviews, refusing to cash in on the fame that clung to her name. Instead, she spent her days in the hangar of a modest flight school on the outskirts of Seattle, guiding students through the fundamentals of flight with patience and an intensity that belied her soft-spoken demeanor. One rainy afternoon, as low clouds draped the horizon and raindrops traced slow paths down the glass of her office window, Vanessa was reviewing maintenance logs when her assistant knocked lightly and stepped inside, an uncertain expression on her face. "There's a young man here," she said. "He says he was on your flight. 982? Vanessa felt her breath catch, a sharp intake she hadn't expected. She rose, smoothing the front of her jacket almost absently, and stepped into the lobby. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was a teenage boy, thin, pale, nervous, clutching a battered duffel bag at his feet. His hair was damp, and his eyes met hers with a mixture of uncertainty and quiet determination. "You probably don't remember me," he began, voice low and hesitant. "I was in seat 23C. I watched you walk to the cockpit that day." Vanessa held his gaze for a long moment. She did remember, though not his seat number. She remembered the boy sitting rigidly, clutching his backpack wide-eyed with fear. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I was on my way to Seattle to live with my dad. My mom had just passed. I thought that flight was going to be the end of everything. But when I found out it was you, a passenger who landed us, something changed. I couldn't stop thinking about it." Then he dropped his gaze and with trembling fingers unzipped the duffel bag at his feet. He pulled out a weathered notebook and held it out to her. Vanessa took it gently and flipped through its pages. Inside were crude but heartfelt sketches of cockpits, airplanes, checklists, notes scribbled in pencil, small diagrams and clumsy aeronautical terms that showed both curiosity and hunger. "I want to fly," he said simply, his voice almost a whisper. "I want to be like you." Vanessa felt a tightness in her chest she hadn't expected. She closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to him. "You have the right instincts," she said. "But tools, training, they cost money, don't they?" The boy nodded quickly, his voice breaking as he admitted he was saving everything he could from a part-time job at a mechanic's shop, but that lessons would take him years to afford. He hadn't come to ask for anything outright. He just wanted her advice, a map forward. Vanessa knelt slightly, lowering herself to his eye level, her voice quiet but steady. "Have you ever heard of the Vanessa Lewis Flight Academy Fund?" The boy froze for a beat, then his eyes widened with realization. "That's yours?" he asked. She nodded once. "It exists for exactly this reason, for people like you. Kids who got a second chance and want to use it." "You're already accepted," she said, her tone final. The boy looked as if he couldn't breathe, his lips trembling. Are you serious?" Vanessa's expression softened as she replied, "I don't hand that to just anyone. But you showed up. You came here. That takes courage most people never summon." And then, without another word, he lunged forward and wrapped his arms around her in a fierce, grateful hug, his emotion spilling over in a way words couldn't convey. Vanessa stood still for a moment, surprised, then gently returned the embrace, her fingers resting lightly on his back. "You're going to fly, Caleb," she murmured, finally learning his name. "But more than that, you're going to lead." That night, after he left with an enrollment packet in hand, Vanessa sat alone in the quiet hangar. The rain continued to patter gently on the roof, the runway lights outside glowing faintly through the mist. She thought of everything that had led her here. The dismissal from the Air Force, the years of silence, the day she almost became a headline alongside 181 others, and now, this boy who had come forward because of that day. This, she realized, was her legacy. Not fame or trophies, but moments like this. Quiet, uncelebrated, personal but profound. Lives changed one story at a time. The months that followed unfolded not as a media spectacle but as a quiet revolution. Vanessa Lewis kept her distance from the cameras, preferring the stillness of her small flight school on the outskirts of Seattle to the noise of headlines and awards ceremonies. But no matter how much she avoided the spotlight, her influence rippled outward in ways she could never have planned. Aviation schools across the country reported an unexpected surge in female applicants and minority cadets. Young women carried notebooks with her name scribbled on the covers, some quoting her simple mantra, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's taking the controls anyway." At airports, strangers recognized her, some pausing just to say thank you, others unable to hold back tears as they recalled where they had been when they first heard the story of Flight 982. Yet Vanessa continued to demur, declining interviews and talk show appearances, staying firmly grounded even as her story inspired thousands. The Vanessa Lewis Flight Academy Fund blossomed into something larger than she had ever envisioned. Over the course of a single year, it funded flight training for dozens of students who otherwise would have been shut out of the sky. One of those students, a tall, determined young woman from Detroit, became the first black female pilot hired by a regional carrier that had previously employed none. Another cadet, a quiet boy from rural Mississippi, spoke openly about how Vanessa's story had led him to believe he could dream bigger than his small town. And Caleb, the boy who had stood damp and nervous in her lobby with a battered notebook, was thriving. He advanced quickly through ground school, earning praise for his focus and raw talent, studying late into the night as Vanessa mentored him directly. She often stayed after hours to work with him in the simulator, patient but exacting, teaching not just technique but mindset, determination, and grace under pressure. But it wasn't only Caleb who flourished. His younger sister, inspired by the changes she witnessed in her brother, soon applied for and earned a scholarship herself, beginning her own flight training at the academy. On crisp autumn afternoons, Vanessa would watch from the tower as both siblings took to the sky, practicing landings and precision turns over the lush green of Washington state. Each takeoff felt like a small victory, a piece of the world rewritten. The once-abandoned airstrip at Mackenzie Ridge, where Flight 982 had made its impossible landing, was now transformed. The runway was resurfaced, a modern control tower installed, and a small memorial placed near the tree line where Vanessa's plane had stopped. A quiet tribute to the day she changed everything. On one such afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled over the tarmac and a light breeze stirred the pines beyond the runway, Vanessa sat in the control tower's small observation room. She watched as Caleb's sister lifted smoothly into the air, the plane's nose rising with confidence and grace, leaving the ground behind. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A message from Captain Grant appeared on the screen. Flight 982 reunion next month. Your place of honor is waiting. Vanessa smiled softly but did not reply right away. She continued to watch the aircraft climbing against the clear blue sky, its path steady and sure. When she finally typed a response, her words were simple. I'll be there. But let them know I was never alone up there. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the runway lights blinked on one by one, Vanessa locked up the flight academy for the night. She paused for a moment at the hangar's entrance, gazing up at the vast expanse of sky overhead, stars just beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. She thought back to the girl she once was, standing on the edge of a different runway years ago, dreaming of flight but uncertain where she would ever belong. She remembered the pain of being told she wasn't enough, not calm enough, not cold enough, not the right kind of leader, and she remembered the cockpit of Flight 982, the feel of the yoke in her hands, the moment she realized she had never stopped being a pilot, no matter how far she had strayed. In that quiet reflection, Vanessa understood that heroism had nothing to do with medals, headlines, or applause. It was about acting when no one else could. It was about turning moments of crisis into chapters of hope. It was about lifting others, one quiet, deliberate gesture at a time. And as she stepped into the night, she knew this truth with certainty. She was no longer just a passenger in anyone's story. She was a pilot, not only of planes but of lives, of dreams, of futures. The sky, vast, unpredictable, and beautiful, was hers to command.